What's up guys, we're back today with a really fun video ranking the dwarf planets. I will just note that all of these rankings and opinions are of course my own, except for the actual facts about the dwarf planets, that is. So if you don't like what I've said, I'm very sorry, please don't get upset. I'd be happy to have a friendly discussion in the comments section though, so please let me know your views. Anyway, let's get started with the knockoff round with things that actually aren't dwarf planets, but people think that they are, and then we'll go on to the second round and then the final round where you'll see my favourite dwarf planet. So first up we have MS4. This is the largest unnamed object in the Kuiper Belt, and it's not actually a dwarf planet, but it might get classified as such in the future. Next up is Salacia. Once again, it is not a dwarf planet, but it is something that people do confuse as one, so let's get that out of the way and out you go. If it were a dwarf planet, it would actually be the 10th largest dwarf planet in the solar system, so that's pretty neat, I guess. Okay, now we're on to actual dwarf planets in this second round, and we're going to start off with Gonggong. Gonggong and its moon Jianglu are actually a scattered disk object, and also they're resonant with Neptune, but they're not a Plutino. Instead of having the typical 2-3 resonance with Neptune, its orbit actually has a 3-10 resonance with Neptune, so it sits a little bit further out in the Kuiper Belt. It's also roughly the size of Charon, and it might actually be one of the reddest objects we've ever discovered in the solar system so far, so that's pretty cool. Up next we have Orcus. Orcus and its moon Vanth have a 2-3 resonance with Pluto, which means it's actually a Plutino. It also has a very crystalline ice structure on its surface, which means that there could be some evidence of volcanism in its past, compared to what we typically see on dwarf planets, which is a very amorphous or higgledy-piggledy structure of ice on its surface, so that's pretty cool. Vanth, the moon, is actually quite big compared to Orcus, with estimates being roughly 12 to 33% its size, meaning that in the previous video when I said that Pluto and Charon were the best binary planet system that we have in the solar system, I might have been lying, maybe not. Sorry about that. Up next we have Ceres. Ceres is interesting because it's the only cis-dwarf planet. It has an atmosphere, and every now and then some water vapour gets evaporated into it. One misconception that we do have is that a lot of people think it was discovered in the 20th or 21st century, but actually it was discovered in 1801, so that's quite a big gap. It's a cool dwarf planet, I just don't like the damn thing. Second to last on the second round, how many times am I going to say second, is Sedna. Now Sedna is the largest dwarf planet without a moon, tied with Ceres of course. We don't know its mass, and its size is more like a friendly suggestion than a certified fact. However, it is so far away that some, not all, scientists call it an Oort cloud object rather than a Kuiper Belt object, and it also gave rise to a new class of objects that are more Oort cloud and Kuiper Belt, like Sedna, called sednoids, one of which being Leleyakuhonua, and yes, I have been learning Hawaiian on Duolingo. Finally, we have this dwarf planet, which I think is pronounced Kwa. Kwa and its moon Waywat are actually named from both indigenous Californian gods, which is pretty cool, with the dwarf planet being roughly half the size of Pluto. What's really cool about Kwa is that it has 2 rings that actually defy the Roche limit, so that's essentially how far out a ring can actually orbit and be stable. What happens is typically a moon or like some asteroid will actually come closer and closer to a planet, but eventually you'll get to a point, the Roche limit, where it'll be so close that it disintegrates into little rock pieces and form a ring or a belt or whatever. But clearly what we can see with Kwa is that we have some rings that are outside this limit but are still stable rings, which is pretty neat. So now we've got those guys out the way, let's go on to the final round. And let's start off with Makemake. Makemake is the second brightest trans-Neptunian object next to Pluto. Despite this, its orbital inclination is ridiculously high, about 28 degrees, meaning it wasn't discovered until 2005, despite it being that bright. In fact, it could have been discovered next to Pluto by Clyde Tombaugh, but it just didn't, and that really annoys me. On Makemake there are also a lot of volatile substances like methane and nitrogen, but there are some also really interesting ones like alkenes such as ethene, which is typically found in fruit on Earth and is used to ripen them and sometimes gives them a nice sweet smell. Another thing that you can find, and don't tell the US Army this, is alkanes such as
propane and propane accessories.
So if you lived on Makemake, it would probably smell like sweet fruit and petrol. Third up we have Eris. Eris is the second largest dwarf planet in the solar system, and it's another scattered disk object, and it also has a moon called Let's try and get this one right. Dysnomia. There we go. Got it right. It has the most ridiculous orbit in this solar system, pretty close to Sedna's level of tomfoolery here. Its furthest point is around 100 AU, so astronomical units, and its closest point surpasses Pluto's orbit and just about kisses Neptune's ass at 38 astronomical units. That's the level of tomfoolery that we have here with this planet. I think that puts its eccentricity at around 0.4, which means it's worse than Mercury, man. Like, this is just absolutely ridiculous. Another bit of pure hooliganism with this dwarf planet is its desperation to not be discovered. It took ages for Makemake to be caught, mainly because the images taken to capture any movement were mostly unsuccessful, because the software trained to, discover the planets would discard anything that would move less than 1.5 arc seconds per hour, and that is basically static at this point. Second up, and one of my personal favourites among the entire solar system, is Haumea. Now, Haumea is the coolest dwarf planet, or just planet in general, that I've ever had the privilege to see. It was discovered by Dr. Michael Brown's team of researchers, and is actually the third largest trans-Neptunian object that we've discovered thus far. A sidereal day on Haumea is about 4 hours, which is, I think, the fastest rotation that any planet or dwarf planet has in the solar system, and it's actually fast enough to squish it into that beautiful rugby ball, stewy head-looking shape that it has. It also has a little red patch, which is kind of cute. I think it might be either tholins or some sort of rich mineral, but I can't say for certain. It also has not one, but 2 moons, whoop whoop, named Hi'iaka and Namaka. Once again, all Hawaiian gods and goddesses. Now, you've most likely already guessed my favourite planet, and that is Pluto. Pluto and Charon are my #1 dwarf planet and planet companion. Pluto on its surface has a really beautiful heart called Tombal Regio. It also has within it mountains, glaciers, and even other things like cryovolcanic resurfacing, all of which are just absolutely stunning. It also has a dark area called Cthulhu Macula, which that in itself is just amazing. It also has some other really cool things like radiogenic heating, which is caused by radioactive elements in the core heating up the mantle itself, which means that it most likely has something like a subsurface ocean, which that in itself is pretty radical. Oh, and of course I forgot to mention it has not 1, not 2, but 5 moons. 4 more than Earth. Like, no joke, for such a small planet, 5 moons is actually ridiculously big. I think just by that statistic alone, it should be given planet classification. I'm just saying. So that's my ranking for, I don't know how many dwarf planets I said, like 8? I can't remember. But I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe you learned something new about all of these planets that you didn't know about before. If you disagree with anything, I'd be happy to hear it in the comments section and we can have a little discussion. I'm not changing my mind about Ceres though, screw that planet, I hate that planet so much.